The Stalker Who Smelled of Dead Fish. What is up, everybody? I'm starting off with a story that was sent in by a viewer, and honestly, this one is pure nightmare fuel, because it all started with something as simple as a smell. It's a chilling reminder of how a normal day can turn terrifying in an instant. Our storyteller is a woman in her 20s, who describes herself as having a ridiculously sensitive nose. She was living in a coastal town where fishing is a big part of the local economy, so the smell of the ocean and fish wasn't totally uncommon. But this was different. One summer evening, she was walking home from work because her car was in the shop. She couldn't stand the thought of the bus because of all the smells, so she was making the trek on foot. That's when she first noticed it. A powerful, foul stench of dead, rotting fish. At first she thought it was just the area, but the smell didn't fade. It was persistent, following her from block to block, getting stronger. It was so out of place for her part of town that a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if the smell wasn't coming from a place, but from a person? Her senses went on high alert. Being a woman walking alone, she didn't want to make a scene. So she ducked into an alcove and pretended to be on her phone while she scanned her surroundings. And that's when she saw him. About 30 feet behind her was a disheveled-looking man, who was stumbling along not like he was drunk, but almost like he had a limp. The moment she stopped, he immediately found a reason to stop, too, pausing at a bench to tie his shoelace. Her gut was screaming at her. This was too much of a coincidence. To test her theory, she started walking again, then stopped abruptly to check her phone once more. Sure enough, he stopped too. She did this a few more times, and every single time, he mirrored her movements. There was no doubt left in her mind. This man was following her. He was wearing a heavy, waterproof fishing coat, which was bizarre because it was a very warm day. He had a scraggly beard, a beanie cap, and was carrying a huge brown fabric bag. She could see a dark, wet patch soaking through the bottom of it, and she knew with certainty that was the source of the horrific smell. The panic began to rise in her throat as she realized she was only a block or two from home. She had no other choice but to lead him right to her front door. She made a break for it, sprinting the last stretch to her 3-story apartment building, fumbling with her keys and slamming the heavy front door behind her, locking it securely. Peeking through the front window, she watched as he lingered outside, looking lost and confused for a moment before shuffling away. She was shaken, but tried to reassure herself it was over. She even told her building superintendent, who promised her the building was secure. For a few days, life went back to normal. She didn't see the man again, and the incident started to fade. But then, one night, she was jolted awake, around 1:30 in the morning. She lives alone, and as a heavy sleeper, she knew something must have been seriously wrong to wake her so suddenly. The air in her apartment felt heavy with a sense of wrongness, and then she smelled it. That same, unmistakable, putrid smell of dead fish was inside her apartment. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed the baseball bat she'd started keeping by her bed since the incident and crept out of her room. She immediately saw how he'd gotten in her front door, was busted open, the wood around the latch splintered. There he was, standing in the darkness of her living room, still holding that damn bag. He seemed drunk or high, just swaying on the spot. As she tried to figure out what to do, her phone charging on the other side of the room, he did something incredibly bizarre. He didn't come toward her, just collapsed into a sitting position on the floor as abruptly as a child, and began rummaging through his bag of rotting fish. The stench became unbearable as he pulled things out, completely fascinated by them. Seeing her chance, she darted past him, grabbed her phone from the kitchen, and locked herself in the bathroom, frantically dialing 911. While on the line with the dispatcher, she heard him get up and wander around, even hearing a lamp crash to the floor. Then silence. A floorboard creaked right outside the bathroom door. The fish smell was overwhelming. She started crying, whispering to the operator that he was right there. It felt like an eternity before she heard shouting, a scuffle, and the blessed voices of police officers. They got him. It turned out he was a local fisherman who had lost everything's business, his family, his sobriety, and his sanity. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital. But for our storyteller, the terror didn't end. She couldn't stay in that apartment. She said no matter how much she cleaned, she could never get rid of that lingering, haunting smell of dead fish. Alright, that last story was intense, but this next one is a different kind of scary. It's a cautionary tale, really, sent in by a guy who is still completely ashamed of how he acted. He wanted me to share it as a warning about how paranoia can twist a terrifying situation into something even worse. The Tinder Date Setup. This story comes from a guy who, about 7 years ago, thought he had hit the jackpot on Tinder. He met a girl he calls Kara, and he says she was perfect, sweet, funny, beautiful, the whole package. After a few great dates, she invited him to stay over at her place. It was a fantastic night. They had dinner, saw a movie, and things got physical for the first time. He describes it as one of the best nights of his life, which just makes what happened next all the more tragic. They fell asleep in each other's arms, but a few hours later, he was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass and two figures bursting into the bedroom. He says it was all a blur of panic and confusion. The intruders, who were masked and armed with a knife and a baton, manhandled him out of the bed and dragged him into the living room. He admits, with a lot of shame, that his first instinct wasn't to protect Kara. He was just so terrified that all he could do was flail and yell. They tied him to a dining chair and then went back to get Kara. He noticed that when they brought her out, the two hooded figures were a lot more gentle with her, which was a strange detail that stuck in his mind. Now this is where his self-described suspicious nature kicked in. He says he tends to overthink everything, and in this moment of terror his mind started racing. The two masked men, who he could tell were guys from their voices, started going through his overnight bag. They took his expensive watch, dangled it in front of him asking if it was fake, and then pocketed it. Then, they forced him to unlock his phone by threatening to hurt Kara in vague but terrifying ways. He noticed again that they were still being weirdly careful with her. Once his phone was unlocked, they changed the passcode, giving them access to his bank details, Apple Pay, everything. They went through his wallet, taking his cash and cards, and in a moment of pure spite, they even shredded a photo he kept of his sister and her family. This act of personal cruelty made him even more suspicious. Why would they do that? Was this personal? And most importantly, they didn't rob Kara at all. They never searched for her purse, didn't take a single thing from the apartment. He was the sole target. After the police came and went, his suspicions started to fester. He recalls one of the officers asking him how well he really knew Kara, and if it seemed like she knew the attackers. That question planted a seed of doubt that grew into a full-blown obsession. In the days that followed, he felt that Kara was being evasive and distant. Looking back, he realizes she was likely just as traumatized as he was. But at the time, his paranoia twisted it into guilt. He started messaging her, at first gently asking if she had any idea who could have done this. But his questions became more and more direct. He pointed out how convenient it was that only he was robbed, that she was left completely unharmed. He could tell his accusations were hurting her, and she became angry and defensive, which he says now she had every right to be. But in his traumatized state, he took her anger as proof of her guilt. Eventually, he just flat out accused her of setting him up. She completely lost it at him, and that was the end of their relationship. But his paranoia didn't stop there. He went full detective, stalking her social media profiles until he found her ex-boyfriend. The guy looked like a weasel, had a criminal record for breaking and entering, and his social media was filled with nice guy self-pity. The protagonist put two and two together and came up with a wild conspiracy theory. Kara and her ex had faked their breakup and were luring unsuspecting Tinder dates to her apartment to be robbed at knife point. He was so convinced that he even told the police his theory. For the next 6 months, he told anyone who would listen the story of the Tinder date who scammed him. Then, one day his world came crashing down. He saw a news story about a local woman who had been the victim of a brutal home invasion and assault, leaving her with life-changing injuries. It was Kara, and the culprit was her ex-boyfriend. The horrible truth hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been so fixated on the idea that Kara was in on it that he never considered the most obvious possibility. He was mostly right, but tragically wrong about the most important part. The ex-boyfriend did break in out of jealousy and rob him as a way to scare him off. But Kara was never part of it. She was just another victim. And scaring him away didn't work to get her back. The ex grew more jealous and violent, eventually going back and attacking her. The narrator says he now lives with the crushing guilt of knowing he blamed an innocent girl for the actions of her abusive ex, and then abandoned her to deal with that monster all on her own. He says he can never ask for her forgiveness, because that poor woman has heard enough from him for a lifetime. Man, some stories just make your skin crawl. And this next one, sent in by a college student, is a masterclass in psychological terror. It starts off as a pretty standard, albeit awful, home invasion story, but it quickly spirals into something so much more violating. This one will definitely make you look twice at every little object in your own room. It's the things they left behind. This story happened in early 2024 to a young woman in her final year of college. She was living in a rented house with a couple of friends, and like a lot of students, they took off for a much-needed spring break vacation. She describes coming home, still buzzing from the trip, but exhausted, only to be met with that sinking feeling of dread when you see something is terribly wrong. The front door to their house was standing ajar. Her heart dropped. They carefully went inside. Probably should have called the cops right then and there, but the shock was too much. The inside of their home was absolute chaos. It looked like a tornado had torn through the place. The thieves hadn't actually taken a huge amount of stuff, but they had made the biggest mess imaginable. Books torn from shelves, food pulled from the pantry and thrown everywhere, couch cushions ripped off and tossed around. It was a scene of pure violation. Thankfully, she had kept her bedroom door locked, so at first, she thought her personal space had been spared. Her one roommate, however, the one who apparently still hides cash under her mattress, had her room completely ransacked and her money stolen. After the initial shock, they spent that first night in a motel, too shaken to stay in the house. The next day was the long, upsetting task of trying to put their lives back together, cleaning up the mess the intruders had left behind. As they started the process of itemizing everything for the insurance claim, the list of stolen goods seemed pretty standard for a burglary: a MacBook Air, their shared PlayStation, and the cash from under the mattress. But as the days went on, they started noticing more and more things were missing, and the items were weird. It wasn't just high-value electronics. An expensive crockpot her mom had given her was gone. A heavy photography book they kept on the living room bookshelf had vanished. But the thing that truly unsettled her, the detail that shifted this from a robbery to something deeply personal and creepy, was a framed photo. It was a picture of the three of them from the previous year's spring break, posing on the beach in their bikinis. She said she had never wanted to frame that picture in the first place. It felt weird having it on display. And now, the idea that some disgusting thief had it, that this person who had violated their home also had this personal image of them, made her feel sick. This is when the paranoia started to set in. She became convinced this wasn't a random burglary. This was someone who knew them, someone who had targeted them specifically. She tried to tell her roommates and the police, but they all told her she was overthinking it. There had been a string of burglaries in the area, and it was most likely just an opportunistic thief who happened to grab the photo. Her fear was amplified when her other roommate noticed that some of her clothes were missing, specifically a few pairs of underwear. She tried to downplay it, saying she might have just forgotten them at the hotel on their trip, but the narrator knew she was just trying to make her feel better. They had been stolen, just like the photo and the PlayStation. The roommate with the mattress money then realized a couple of pieces of her jewelry were gone too. The narrator, meanwhile, was just grateful that her locked room had kept the thief out of her stuff. But then her roommates pointed out something chilling. The simple lock on her bedroom door could easily be opened from the outside with a screwdriver. Her sense of security vanished. She immediately tore her room apart, checking everything, but to her relief, nothing was missing. All her clothes, her keepsakes, even a very expensive necklace she had inherited from her grandmother, it was all still there. Surely, she thought, if a thief had gotten into her room, they would have taken that necklace. She thought she was safe. She was so wrong. One night, a few days later, she was lying in bed, her mind racing with paranoia, unable to sleep. Her eyes drifted to her side dresser. She noticed something that wasn't there before, a cheap-looking ballpoint pen, like the kind you get at a bank. She didn't remember putting it there. She picked it up, tried to scribble on a piece of paper, but it didn't work. Annoyed, she just shrugged and threw it in the trash. But back in bed, the image of the pen wouldn't leave her mind. It was just another small, wrong detail in a house that no longer felt like her own. Her eyes scanned her room, across her photo board, her paintings, her computer, and then to her shelf of plushies. And that's when she saw it. Tucked among her familiar stuffed animals was a teddy bear she had never seen before in her life. A wave of cold dread washed over her. Hiding under her covers, she slowly got out of bed, went over to the shelf, and picked up the strange bear. It looked expensive, and she definitely hadn't bought it. As she held it, she could feel something hard inside its soft body. She looked at its glassy, dead shark eyes, and thought she saw a tiny, unnatural glint in one of them. Turning the bear over, she found a small slit in the fabric. Her hand shaking, she reached inside and pulled out a small, hard object. It was a spy cam. The horror of that moment is hard to imagine. She threw it on the floor and began to frantically tear her room apart, searching for other devices. She found the pen she had thrown in the trash. It was a camera. She found a smiley face badge she didn't recognize. It was a camera. A plush snelled another camera. And then, hidden in her bathroom, a second spy cam pen. The thief hadn't just come to take their things. It'd come to leave things behind, to watch her. The police came, and they confirmed her worst fears. The cameras were cheap, wireless models with a very short broadcast range. That meant whoever planted them had to be nearby to receive the signal. It was likely one of their neighbors, or someone sitting in a car right outside their house, watching her every move for days. That realization completely destroyed her. She and her roommates couldn't stay in that house another night. The knowledge that someone had been watching them in their most private moments, it's not just for a moment but continuously, was a violation that she says she's still trying to get over. The scariest part of this whole story isn't what was stolen from her house, but what was left behind. All right, let's keep this train of terror rolling. This next story was sent in by a father who thought he was taking his family on a peaceful Thanksgiving getaway, but they ended up stumbling into someone else's twisted plan for revenge. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the friendliest faces hide the darkest intentions. The Cabin Invader. Our narrator, a family man with a wife and 3 young kids, wanted to escape the stress of big city life for a while. His good friend, Derek, offered them the use of his hunting lodge near Grand Teton for Thanksgiving week. It was supposed to be the perfect palate cleanser. Quiet, quality family time, no distractions. He, his wife, and their 3 kids, 10-year-old daughter, 8-year-old autistic son, and a 4-year-old made the long road trip up to the cabin. When they finally arrived, the kids, who had been to the cabin before, burst out of the car and ran straight for the front door, throwing it open with excitement. But a second later, his eldest daughter, Lisa, came running back out, her face a mask of shock and embarrassment. "Daddy," she said, breathless, "there's someone already in there." He had no idea what was going on, so he sprinted up the porch steps and burst inside. His 2 younger kids were standing frozen in the entryway. And there, in the middle of the living room, a thin, wiry guy was reclined on the couch in nothing but his boxers, holding a beer. The guy sprang up, holding his hands up in surrender, and started laughing. He introduced himself as Blake and explained that he was an old high school buddy of Derek's. He said he was going through a nasty divorce, and Derek, knowing the cabin would be empty, had offered it to him as a place to clear his head over the holiday. Now, the narrator says this explanation made perfect sense. His friend Derek was a great guy, but a total airhead, what he called a himbo. Double booking his cabin by mistake was exactly the kind of thing Derek would do. Blake seemed like a genuinely nice guy, and he was super apologetic about the mix-up. He even offered to pack up and leave immediately, saying he didn't want to ruin their family vacation. The narrator felt bad, but with 3 kids, including his son who has a hard time with new situations, sharing the small cabin wasn't really an option. He gratefully accepted Blake's offer to leave. Blake just asked if they could give him a couple of hours to clean himself up and pack his things. That seemed totally reasonable. So the narrator piled his family back into the car and drove to the small town about 20 minutes away to kill some time. While the kids got ice cream, he decided to call Derek and give him a hard time about the double booking. He casually mentioned that they had run into his friend Blake at the cabin. The reaction he got on the other end of the line sent a shiver down his spine. Derek's voice went from cheerful to frantic. "Blake?" He said, "That prick who used to bully me in high school? I heard he was busted on drug charges." The narrator at first thought Derek was just messing with him, but Derek started yelling, begging him to take it seriously. He said Derek never yelled. That's when the full weight of the situation hit him. This wasn't a mix-up. The man in the cabin was a dangerous imposter. Derek told him to leave his wife and kids in town and go back to the cabin with the police immediately. Derek called his buddy at the local sheriff's department, and soon the narrator was riding back to the cabin in a police cruiser. When they arrived, the front door was hanging wide open. The place had been utterly destroyed. The TV was smashed, glass was everywhere, the couch had been shredded with a knife, and hateful words were spray-painted on the walls. The police figured the vandalism must have started long before they arrived. Blake had likely been there for days, slowly carrying out some twisted revenge fantasy against Derek. The narrator was filled with a white-hot rage, thinking about how this violent, unhinged person had been smiling and laughing with his family just a couple of hours earlier. They were just thinking how lucky they were that he had decided to leave when they heard it. A cough coming from the ceiling. More coughs, and the creak of floorboards from the attic crawlspace above them. He showed the officers where the hatch was. A deputy pulled it open, a ladder unfolded, and a head peeked out. It was Blake, covered in dust and filth. He had been hiding up there the whole time, listening to them. Thankfully, he was too drunk and high to put up a fight and was taken into custody. The story could have ended there, but the most chilling part was what the police found in the guest bedroom. Blake had come prepared. He had rope, duct tape, a hatchet, and a handgun. No one knows what he was planning to do with those things. But the narrator QA and stopped thinking about what might have happened if he and his family had uninterrupted him. That quiet family vacation almost turned into an absolute horror story. You know, the internet has given us some amazing things, but it has also spawned a uniquely modern brand of idiot, the clout chasing. IRL streamer, who thinks committing crimes and terrorizing people for views is a legitimate career path. This next story was sent in by an 18-year-old viewer from the UK, and it's a terrifying, first-hand account of what happens when one of these wannabe internet stars takes things way, way too far. The Jizzler's Rampage, our storyteller sets the scene by talking about a guy in the UK named Mizzy, who became infamous for filming himself doing pranks that included walking into random people's houses. He actually served time for it, but his idiotic actions inspired a legion of copycats. One of these wannabes was a guy in her year at college who, and I am not making this up, called himself the Jizzler. She describes him as a particularly pathetic and unrelatable guy who was obsessed with Mizzy-esque clips and was constantly trying to impress people with his own stupid stunts, like leaping down stairs or pranking teachers, all while live streaming to his massive audience of about 10 followers. To make matters worse, this guy had a huge crush on her, so she was often the unwilling audience for his cringy attempts at humor, flanked by his giggling idiot friends. She mostly just tried to ignore him, but one day he made that impossible. She was at her house with her best friend, Annalise, working on some homework. Her dad and stepmom were out for the night, so the two girls were home alone. Around 6 p.m., the doorbell rang. She went to answer it, thinking it was just a package delivery. But standing on her doorstep were the Jizzler and one of his friends, and they were completely wasted. As she stood there in shock, the Jizzler took a deep hit from a nitrous balloon. Before she could even process what was happening, he shoved past her and forced his way into her house, leaving his friend on the doorstep. She had just enough presence of mind to slam the door shut and lock the other guy out. But the Jizzler was already stumbling down her hallway, holding his phone up on a selfie stick. He was trying to narrate his prank, but he was so drunk and high that his words were just a stream of nonsensical gibberish. As he reeled down the hall, he crashed into a side table, sending an expensive vase shattering to the floor. She shrieked and tried to grab him, but he shoved her hard against the wall, sending a collection of framed family photos crashing down. At this point, she was incandescent with rage. She screamed at him that this was a crime, that he couldn't just do this, but he just laughed, completely oblivious. He staggered into the living room, and that's when her friend Annalise came running in, her face a mask of horror. The Jizzler, still filming his rampage, found the one thing in the room that was absolutely sacred: her grandmother's ornament cupboard. It was filled with little glass models and keepsakes she had inherited when her gran went into a care home. He turned to his phone camera, and with a sweeping motion of his arm, he wiped an entire shelf of her grandmother's precious ornaments onto the floor, where they shattered into a million pieces. Both girls were screaming now. The Jizzler just laughed and grabbed another ornament, flinging it against the wall. The narrator lunged at him again, slapping and clawing at him, but he seemed to feel no pain. He shoved her again, even harder this time, and she fell backward, her tailbone cracking against the metal fireplace grate. A shot of instant, sharp pain went through her, and she started sobbing, a mix of pain, rage, and helplessness. Meanwhile, the Jizzler was tearing the living room apart, throwing cushions, knocking the TV to the floor where it sparked, and even using his selfie stick to smash the light fixtures. In the midst of this chaos, her friend Annalise disappeared. For a second, she felt a flash of anger. How could she leave her alone with this lunatic? But then Annalise reappeared. In one hand, she was holding her phone, and the narrator could see she was on an active call. In the other hand, she was holding a large kitchen knife. She yelled at the Jizzler to stop. He paused, looked at the knife, and then let out this insane, hooting laugh. That's when the narrator noticed something absurd. The Jizzler's phone screen was black. The battery was dead. This absolute moron thought he was live streaming his masterpiece, but he was just rampaging through her house for an audience of 0. Instead of stopping, he reached for an ornament above the fireplace. She scrambled out of his way and looked up to see what he had. It was her grandfather's urn. He was holding the urn with her granddad's ashes in it, waving it around recklessly. She jumped to her feet and screamed the only thing she could think of. That's my bloody granddad. And for some reason that broke through the haze of drugs and alcohol. It was like she had slapped him. He froze, staring at her, and the stupid, maniacal look on his face was replaced by one of shame and confusion. He looked around at the devastation he had caused, and then, almost comically, he very gently placed the urn back on the mantelpiece, collapsed onto the sofa, and just sat there until the police arrived. The case is still ongoing, but the Jizzler has effectively tanked his own life, all for a prank that nobody even saw. This final story for tonight is one of the most unique home invasion stories I have ever come across. It was sent in by a man who wanted to share his experience. And it's a powerful reminder that home is not always a house with 4 walls and a roof. For him, home was his car. And the night his home was invaded was one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. But it ended in a way no one could have ever predicted. The joyride, our narrator begins his story by explaining that, at the time this happened, back in the winter of 2018, he was unhoused. He was living a nomadic lifestyle in his '87 Ford Fiesta, a combination of falling on hard times and a desire to stay off the grid. He makes it clear that this car wasn't just a car. It was his sanctuary, his bedroom, his entire world on wheels. The night this all went down was a bitterly cold one. He was parked in a desolate lot in the middle of nowhere, bundled up in a mountain of sleeping bags in the back seat, completely dead to the world. He was woken up not by a sound, but by a sensation, the distinct and utterly impossible feeling of his entire world shifting. His car was moving. For a moment, in the fog of sleep, it didn't register. But then, as his mind cleared, he heard them. 2 young-sounding voices coming from the front seat. They were laughing and talking about taking the car for a joyride, about having some fun in the fields. They had found what they thought was an abandoned car and decided to take it for a spin. He had been carjacked, but with a terrifying twist. He was still inside, and the thieves had absolutely no idea. Panic set in. He was lying completely still under his pile of sleeping bags, his heart hammering against his ribs. What was he supposed to do? The car was already moving at a decent speed. He had no idea who these kids were or what they might do if they discovered him. His mind raced with horrifying possibilities. They could crash and kill all of them. Or, even worse, they could get to their destination, turn around, and realize the homeless guy who owns the car is still in the back. He knew that would make him a witness. And he had no idea if these were just dumb kids or people capable of silencing him permanently. He decided his only option was to stay hidden and pray they got bored and just ditched the car. From their accents and their silly, juvenile conversation, he figured they were just bored local kids, not hardened criminals. But then again, they had managed to hotwire his car. He had the keys in his pocket and were currently in the process of committing a felony. So they couldn't be all that innocent. The car was bumping and bouncing violently over potholes as they sped down backcountry roads. He could tell they had left the main roads and were heading deep into the countryside, felt his teeth chattering, partly from the rough ride and partly from pure unadulterated terror. He was desperately trying to come up with an escape plan. Should he just spring up and surprise them? Try to appeal to whatever good nature they might have? Or should he try to leap from the moving vehicle? He was seriously considering the second option. The car wasn't going too fast, and it felt like they were on soft, muddy ground. He was just about to take his chances and make a jump for it when the car lurched to a sudden stop. The kids were muttering something about being bored. A wave of relief washed over him. Maybe this was it. Maybe they were just going to leave and he could get away scot-free. He heard both front doors open and then slam shut. He was safe. And that's when he heard the sound of breaking glass and smelled the acrid scent of gasoline and smoke. His blood ran cold. He knew exactly what was happening. In his part of the UK, it was an almost rite of passage for some kids to steal an old car, take it for a joyride, and then torch it. They had thrown a makeshift Molotov cocktail through the now-smashed window, and his home, his entire world, was going up in flames. Flames were already licking up the front passenger seat as he tore the sleeping bags off himself and scrambled for the back door. It was locked. He fumbled with the stiff manual lock, his fingers clumsy with panic. The smoke was getting thick. He started banging on the window with all his might. This finally got the attention of the joyriders. He saw their faces for the first time, two young guys, their expressions of gleeful mischief instantly replaced by sheer horror. For one long, terrifying moment, he thought they were just going to watch, let the evidence, and the only witness, burn. Thankfully, they were better kids than that. They ran back to the burning car, smashed the back window, frantically helped him climb out, pulling him free just as the flames engulfed the interior. What followed, he says, was a panicked, tearful, an incredibly sincere apology as the three of them ran from the field. None of them wanting to deal with the inevitable arrival of the police. The boys, who were home from university, swore they genuinely thought the car had been abandoned there for weeks. And looking at their guilt-stricken faces, he chose to believe them. And this is where this story takes its unbelievable turn. He says that while it was a terrifying experience that left him with nothing, he doesn't regret his decision not to press charges. The boys' families were incredibly kind and understanding. They took him in, made sure he was okay, and helped him get back on his feet. He says that through this insane near-death experience, he ended up finding friends for life. Most unbelievable ending to a story of extreme irresponsibility. But it just goes to show that you can find humanity in the most terrifying and unexpected of places.